So we had Death Guard in 8th edition, Necrons in 9th edition, Tyranids in 10th, but what's most likely to be coming in 11th edition? Hello and welcome back to Warsbets Tactics, where today I thought we could talk some edition launch box sets and antagonist factions for 40k, what are the patterns for how they've been in the past, and what might be coming in the future. For starter sets for Warhammer 40k, Games Workshop had a fairly consistent pattern. Basically, each edition starts out with Space Marines versus another faction in a big 1 versus 1 box. That's been the case since the 2nd edition of the game. Over that time, it's always been a Xenos or Chaos army, no Imperial infighting, and from 5th edition onwards, I'd argue that the spectacle has gradually increased. Games Workshop switching focus for the big box sets to have a really heavy focus on the miniatures themselves, giving you bigger and bigger armies on each side. Quite a serious amount of new sculpts of miniatures, some of which are new remakes of things that came before, and some are entirely new units to the game. In 9th and 10th edition, the formula has done particularly well for Games Workshop, with enormous sales of things like the Indomitors box set and Leviathan box set. Really big money makers for Games Workshop for both of those, and seems unlikely that they're going to change up the formula anytime soon while that's the case. So while it is a really long way in the future, I still think it's interesting enough to speculate what the next box might be, as they do tend to follow a bit of a pattern. Obviously 11th edition is still a very long way off. I'm not really trying to get impatient for it or anything like that. We're around about exactly 1/3 of the way through 10th edition so far by Games Workshop's usual release cycle. I'm sure we've got lots of other interesting releases to come there, plenty of release waves for armies whose codexes haven't come out yet. It's not like 10th edition is going to be going away particularly soon. It's got around about 2 years left on the clock, judging by their normal release cycle, 8th and 9th edition both being 3 years long, so 10th edition is likely to be as well. I still think it's fun to do a bit of speculating though, and talking over some of the possibilities. For the Imperial faction, Space Marines seem near enough certain. They're the biggest army and the widest appeal, pretty much the poster boys of the setting. Unless they make something super boring or ugly, it's almost guaranteed to sell well. There's definitely going to be a lot of thought and effort placed into these big box sets. The exact quality of the contents could be the difference between a lot of money gained or lost for GW. I think they'd have to be seriously brave, risk deviating away from the boys in power armor, seeing as that's worked quite so well over the past couple of editions. It does generally seem to be the half of the box set that gets in more demand when, say, things are resold individually on eBay, partly just due to the fact that there's both core Space Marine players and then all the Divergent chapters who can also make good use of the contents. So far, I think the most adventurous that they got with the Space Marine side was going for Dark Vengeance, where they very much made them Dark Angel Space Marines with all their iconography and everything on them. I feel like it's perhaps kind of unlikely that they'd do similar to that again though. That was definitely an edition where there was a lot of shoulder pads having their chapter symbols scraped off, so people could use them for different chapters other than just the Unforgiven. Still seems they've got plenty of things they can quite easily release for Space Marines as well, even just updating things like Vanguard Veterans, and maybe the Devastator or Tactical Squad if they feel like it, seem like they're fairly easy choices. Never mind doing Primaris versions of everything else that they've had in the past. Maybe things like Ironclad Dreadnoughts or some of their other tank variants, or things like the Terminator Assault Squad, which seem guaranteed to get an update at some point. It wasn't the Space Marines that I wanted to focus on today though, more the choice of the Antagonist faction. Some nice Xenos or Chaos for the Space Marines to fight. As mentioned, they don't tend to do Imperium versus Imperium style box sets, unless they had some sort of major and crazy lore development. And that means there's a list of armies for which it's almost certainly going to be one of. I feel like we can rule out quite a lot of them due to either recency or low chance of Games Workshop going for them as a major release. Just for context, here were their past releases for the 40k starter sets. In 2nd edition, it was Orks with all those Monopose Gretchen and Monopose Orks with the axes. In 3rd edition, it was against 20 Dark Eldar Kabbalite warriors, long before they were renamed Drukhari for that one. In 4th edition, it was some Tyranid Genestealers and Termagants with the Battle of Macragge, and then things started to step up a bit, and the box size to feel more like entire armies, Orks with Assault on Black Reach with the Death Copters, and 6th and 7th edition for Chaos Space Marines in Dark Vengeance fighting the Unforgiven Dark Angels. That was the one with the Hellbrute for them. Then things definitely kicked up a notch with Death Guard and Dark Imperium. That was the dawn of the Primaris Marines, and there were Plague Marines, Poxwalkers, and the Feated Bloat Drone in that one. Then bigger still in Indomitors with Space Marines versus Necrons with Scorpec Destroyers, Necron Warriors, and the Canoptet Reanimator. And then of course in 10th edition we've had Tyranids with Leviathan. That one does feel like the single most spectacular one out of them yet. The Psychophage, the Neuro Tyrant, loads of Gaunts, and a bunch of elite infantry as well. Between all of these, it does feel like there's a bit of a pattern, at least in the modern 40k era. It usually tends to be armies that have had good followings or interests that haven't been the focus of a major release for a while. Necrons and Tyranids definitely seem to exemplify that. Factions with quite big lore presence and followings, but no big releases in a really long time, so Games Workshop could absolutely go to town on them with good justification. I say it also tends to be a bit more of an evil or chaotic themed force, perhaps, to style as a contrast to the Primaris Marines. We've never had an Eldar or a Tau Empire box set, for example. I feel like we are kind of unlikely to, just due to having two sort of more ordered and good style forces fighting against each other. Even if this is 40k and all sides are flawed for all sorts of reasons. Perhaps the most unusual one out of the entire list was Death Guard, where they actually launched an entire faction. It seemed to work out quite well for them though, and the Death Guard models definitely were popular. Maybe Dark Eldar also feel a bit unusual given that they're kind of a niche faction, but that was going back a long time, all the way back to 3rd edition. Games Workshop is in a very different place to all the way back then. To look at the possibilities for 11th though, that would mean that there's around about 14 to 16 armies as possible, 6 factions of Chaos and 8 factions worth of Xenos, and I also chose to include Emperor's Children and Dark Mechanicum in the reckoning as well. Emperor's Children because they're basically confirmed that they're coming at some point, and Dark Mechanicum because they've been one of the most requested fan armies for really quite a long time, and Games Workshop have delivered on really quite a lot of other fan army requests since then. Plus, Vashtor does feel like he is an early outrider for them and might be followed up with a faction of his own at some stage. That's definitely far more speculative than Emperor's Children right now, though. I think it is kind of easy enough to eliminate a few of them, though. Death Guard, Tyranids, and Necrons all feel far too recent to have a new major model release done for them. I'm sure to confuse everyone a little bit if 11th edition was "Oh, the Tyranids have come back again," but I suspect that probably wouldn't drive the same kind of hype. If you take them out, then that leaves this list, though I must admit there's quite a few choices here that I just think are incredibly unlikely to be major focuses of launch factions. I thought to talk through them with a bit of feedback from you guys as well. I'd do a poll to ask which ones you thought were the most likely, and these ones were all notably lower than the rest, and I must admit I'd be pretty surprised if Games Workshop chose any of these factions to be the main focal faction of a new edition, far more likely to get release waves within an edition as opposed to headlining it. Chaos Knights are just kind of on the wrong scale to have any sort of interactive duels with things like Space Marines. Chaos Demons, I think, operate a bit differently and tend to be a bit more peripheral than the direct antagonist to the setting in 40k for the most part. G to the Cult are really quite niche in terms of play rates in Warhammer 40k, and generally already have quite a nice and well developed range that's been redone quite recently, just seems super unlikely to be them. Leagues of Votan and World Eaters have kind of already had their big in the spotlight moment when they've launched. I'd guess that they're going to get second waves of miniatures in 10th edition, though it seems sort of unlikely that they'd take centre stage against the Space Marines. Leagues of Votan also feel like more of a Force of Order type thing. They've maybe got quite a few similarities with Space Marine type forces as opposed to differences in terms of fighting style. Then Thousand Suns, again, I would be kind of surprised. It's a slightly less eclectic army compared with some. And we've already had the big exciting release for them that people might expect in their Primarch, though admittedly they did do Death Guard as a focal faction, but that did feel a bit different as the actual launch of them. The other one that you guys seem to think was super unlikely were the Tau Empire, and maybe I feel like I could see them being a focal faction a bit more so than most of the others, mainly just due to play rate. They are one of the bigger and more popular and more collected armies out there. And while they did get their fairly enormous Kroot release wave this year, they haven't actually had a proper Tau release for at least a good few years now. Though again, if Games Workshop do want to go for things that have a more chaotic, disordered and evil antagonist on the one side, then Tau might not be the choice they choose to go for. I do still think they'd be unlikely to be fair, but I'd probably rate them as a bit more likely than a few of the others. In any case though, if we remove those armies that people generally think are super unlikely, that leaves us with 6 left, and these are Chaos Marines, Emperor's Children, Aeldari, Drukhari, Orks and Dark Mechanicum, or something else new. Talking through these in the order in which you guys predicted, Aeldari were a bit lower than most of the rest with only 6% of the vote. They're in a bit of an interesting place where they certainly do need a future release. They've got a ton of stuff that still needs updates, things like aspects like the Warp Spiders, Fire Dragons and Swooping Hawks, lots of the Phoenix Lords, and a fair few other things besides. Plus they are one of 40k's more stable and well-known armies, where I think they've got a following that'd be good enough to justify a main headline release. They're maybe not one of the absolute most collected armies in the game in the same way as some of the other Xenos factions are, but feels like they'd jump up the ranks a bit if they were given a central release. I guess it could be an opportunity to expand their narrative a bit more, either dig into the Inari thing that they've all had going on, or go in a different direction. For reasons they might be less likely though, they already did have a very major release in 9th edition, so had quite a lot of focus with a bunch of kits that they might have wanted to save to a major edition such as the Avatar of Cain, and people are perhaps expecting them to get a follow-up release in 10th edition itself to follow the 9th edition one, if Games Workshop does choose to revisit them so early. Again, if we're talking about contrast between Space Marines and other factions, Aeldari generally seem to be one of the more ordered and like anti-chaos type factions in 40k. And again, maybe they aren't quite as well collected as a few of the other options out there, maybe Orks and Chaos Marines in particular out of the factions that we've got left. Next up, Chaos Space Marines were suspected by 11% of people. They're kind of the big bad of Warhammer 40k, with Abaddon the Despoiler's relentless crusade against the Imperium, plus one of the game's most popular factions, and I do feel like they probably do have enough releases to justify them as a centerpiece faction. The Chaos Terminator kit isn't ancient, but there was certainly a bit of clamouring to upscale it to a similar one to match the Loyalists at some point. Plus they could do with some new bags, maybe some new Legion characters, and there are some big releases that you could do for them, things like the undivided Primarchs like Perturabo and Lorgar. I guess for reasons against, they have had a launch box in the not desperately distant past, the 6th and 7th edition Dark Vengeance one, and maybe do feel like they've done quite well out of the more modern 40k Primaris sort of era. A fair few releases in 8th edition and then in 9th. Games Workshop has really overhauled the majority of the faction in the not too distant past, even if there's still a few bits that might need more. I personally say they're probably a bit unlikely due to a fairly modern range, but perhaps don't seem impossible if Games Workshop wanted to go that way. Next up, 11% of people voted for Dark Mechanicum. I guess if Games Workshop did choose to expand Vashtor and his forces a bit more, it could be an equivalent of how the Death Guard came about as a new faction. Certainly Games Workshop feel like they've done a massive amount of setup with Vashtor out and about looking for godhood and a big vault of weapons. I can't help but think that that's been engineered in a way that could lead to new models at some point. They have also been one of the most commonly requested fan favourite factions from the lore that I'd like to see Games Workshop make miniatures from, and when I made a video about fan requested armies a while back, Games Workshop have ticked a lot of boxes, basically giving huge releases to the Kroot, remaking the squats as Leagues of Votann, releasing World Eaters, and looking like they're doing the same for Emperor's Children. Out of the major requests, Dark Mechanicum are one of the only ones from that list that remain. I don't know whether we would actually do them for an edition launch though. It does feel like there'd be more of a gamble to go with something completely new than a faction that already has a following. And of course, in terms of likeliness for 11th edition, we don't actually have any firm confirmation that they're even coming out at any point so far. So it seems maybe a little bit less likely until Games Workshop start dropping a few more absolute hints in that direction. Definitely doesn't seem impossible though. It'd certainly be an exciting way to start a new edition. Next up, we've got the Drukhari, where 13% of people predicted them. At least in terms of factions that need a major update and release wave, they're certainly right up there. They haven't had a big 40k release in ages. Lots of their miniatures were in fine cast resin and then went out of production, like Grotesque, Urian Rakath, the Court of the Archon, and the Beastmasters. Plus, there's a really big, obvious central release that they can do in Astra Belvex himself. Feels like he maybe could be an equivalent sort of miniature to how they released the Silent King for the Necrons. Technically, they do have precedent of being in a long past launch box in 3rd edition and do have some good contrast against the Space Marines. Though I feel like any releases that happened that long ago just don't really have too much bearing on what Games Workshop might do now. In all honesty though, I would really not expect Games Workshop to release Drukhari as a central faction for a new edition. They're just a really quite niche army compared with many. I think part of the reason for the neglect is that they just don't have quite as huge a fan base. And for factions like that, Games Workshop just tends to update them really quite sporadically, and maybe a little bit more of a curtailed release wave than they do. I just can't really see them gambling on Drukhari to carry the entirety of the edition. They maybe do tend to be seen as a bit more niche and peripheral in the lore as well, the entire thing being them raiding from Comera and stealing away slaves and souls to sustain themselves with pain. Just maybe not quite the same sort of feeling as a galactic-wide threat as a few of the other factions in the game. They certainly could write something interesting for them. In general, I feel like Drukhari are far more likely to get a good release alongside a codex as opposed to an edition launch. I wouldn't rate them as particularly high for the 11th edition release. Then finally we come to the last two. Voted in second place were the Emperor's Children. 23% of people said this. Perhaps not too surprising that there's a lot of people suspecting that they could be the faction that comes out for 11th. We basically know that they're getting a release at some point due to their units being farmed off into their own index. And if they weren't going to be their standalone thing anytime soon, they would have kept them in the Chaos Codex. It's the same sort of thing as they did with the World Eaters last time round. In terms of model releases, they've certainly got enough exciting stuff to release for them. Basically a new faction launching in a similar sort of way to Death Guard. They could do a similar sort of scale release for them for the launch of it, maybe with Demon Engines, no doubt Fulgrim returning, new Noise Marines, Lucius, and Terminators. Again, I feel like, as with Dark Mechanicum, it could be a bit less of a safe bet and a bit more of a gamble versus things like Tyranids and Necrons that we've had over the last couple. If Games Workshop want something with broad appeal, I feel like the Emperor's Children certainly appeal to certain people, but maybe not to everyone. I'm sure they'll be a popular release when they come out, but maybe not quite on the same sort of level as armies that are already collected by loads. When they announced Index Emperor's Children being its own thing, my first instinct was it's probably going to run in a similar sort of timetable to how World Eaters did. It seems like the good time for Games Workshop to release factions seems to be towards the end of an edition, just because they don't usually want to have armies getting their codexes right just before the next edition drops. It kind of feels like it's a bit incomplete and they haven't really had much time to play. Smallish scale new armies seem like they're just pretty ideal to drop at that sort of time frame, as it fills the gap between the main bulk of the codexes coming out and the next edition of the game launching. Overall, if I'd had to guess between the two, I would have guessed late 10th as opposed to an 11th army, though it definitely feels like it's a bit more possible than a bunch of the others. They could just rinse and repeat what they did with Death Guard and the launch of the Primaris, and if so, it might mean that the Emperor's Children might rise to be one of the best supported Chaos Legions, if they did show them similar sort of love to Mortarian's Chosen. Finally though, and just beating out the Emperor's Children by a little bit on the poll, were the Orks. 25% of you said that Games Workshop would choose them as the next launch faction. Pretty much just a major proportion of people saying that as opposed to a majority or anything like that, but it does seem that them and Emperor's Children stick out a fair bit above the rest. I feel like there is a lot of reason to suspect Orks. They're one of the most popular factions in Warhammer 40K and haven't featured in a launch box since all the way back in 5th edition. I think it is kind of safe to say an Orcs vs Space Marine box would have a ton of appeal, and there was a whole load of excitement for the Assault on Black Reach launch back when that came out. Otherwise, they do fit the bill as a good contrast to Space Marines, hoardy and violent and chaotic as opposed to neat orders and noble warrior knights and things. I feel like despite their releases, they do have a bunch of stuff that still could be updated. Things like Weird Boys, a bunch of their special characters that went away in resin, perhaps tank busters, and a few older kits like looters and burners, and to be honest, the standard boys kit still probably needs a second look at it. All sorts of other stuff they could realise from the lore as well. A proper Orky battle tank with an actually dangerous big gun would be kind of fun. Or it would be really fun to see things like grot tanks return from Legends in plastic. I'd say perhaps the biggest reason to think against Orks is they have had a couple of good releases over 8th and 9th edition. 8th edition they got Ghazghkull Thraka himself, plus the slightly crazy wave of 7 October buggies if you want to collect Mad Max Orks. And then they had genuinely quite a good release in 9th edition with their Beast Snaggers and a fair few other kits redone besides that, plus their Commandos and Kill Team. Between all that, given all the releases that they've had, they haven't really been doing too badly. They maybe still feel like they could be in a place where another release wave would be really cool. I can see why people have voted for them quite a bit though. They do seem like maybe one of the most logical out of the big following armies, and they certainly seem like one of the ones that are most possible if Games Workshop want to try and echo the success of Indomitus then Leviathan. Obviously it's still very early days yet, and it feels like 10th edition might give us a few more clues as to releases that come out inside of it. I feel like if either Aeldari or Drukhari get a big release wave, it'll probably count them out for any sort of 11th edition faction, and the same for Emperor's Children or even Dark Mechanicum of course. I guess Orcs and Chaos we're probably not getting any more clues on, given that we've already had their Codex release, and they both have minor character releases for now. Finally, I thought it might be interesting to ask people what you'd choose it to be if you literally could choose, never mind of what Games Workshop is likely to. Kind of unsurprisingly, people were a bit more fragmented on this one. Interestingly enough, it was Drukhari and Dark Mechanicum that won the vote here, just a little bit over Emperor's Children. I guess these three are kind of logical on the list that I gave people, given that Drukhari really are missing quite a lot of miniatures in their range that they should have already, never mind the fact that they haven't had a release in a really long time, and Dark Mechanicum and Emperor's Children are both breaking new ground with new cool armies, so no surprise that people are keen to see them come about. Otherwise voted in around about 7 or 8%, demons, Tau, Eldari and Orks all were about that level. Kind of interesting that a lot of people would try and make the release a demons or Tau one, even if kind of few people think that it's actually likely. In any case though, seems like most people are most suspicious of either Orcs or Emperor's Children getting the main antagonist faction role for 11th edition at present, with Drukhari, Dark Mechanicum and Chaos Space Marines being a bit more of an outside bet, and Aeldari being ranked after them. Let me know your thoughts though. What do you think the Games Workshop will release for 11th edition? And if you could choose, what would you have them release if you could just literally pick any army? For anyone wondering about this slide, by the way, I thought it'd put an Orc Mega Armored War Boss with a Chaos icon and one of Vashdor's wings together. Seemed like a good unholy mashup of a few of the possibilities to me. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, including new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.